Welcome to the Gospel Addict podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're picking up on a topic that, well, you've shown real interest in. Today, we're really zeroing in on the 5 S's of the gospel.
Right.
We've mentioned this framework before,
Yeah.
As a way to get to the heart of the gospel message.
Yeah, it's come up a few times.
And your questions, your feedback, it told us you're ready to explore it a bit more thoroughly.
Absolutely. There's definitely been a clear curiosity around these S's. So, yeah, we're excited to dedicate this time to really unpacking the first one.
And we're doing this with a special focus, really remembering Dave Johnson.
Yeah.
For some of you, maybe the recent rebroadcast of our interview with him might ring a bell. He was, well, truly a spiritual giant.
He really was.
Someone who just profoundly understood and, more importantly, lived out these very principles. And a huge mentor to one of us. So yeah, with deep respect, we're diving into these foundational truths starting right now.
Amen. Yeah, Dave's life was such a powerful illustration of these core concepts. Exploring the S's feels like a really fitting way to honor his impact.
So let's jump straight in then. Our focus today is the very first of these 5 S's, scale.
Scale. Okay. Now, when we say scale here, we're not talking about inches or pounds, are we? It's something more conceptual.
Exactly. That's right. This scale is about a sense of proportion, you could say, a way of calibrating our understanding.
Calibrating? How?
Particularly when we consider who God is and who we are in relation to him. It's really about getting our cosmic perspective right.
Ah, okay. Yeah. And what's fascinating is how easily that perspective can get skewed, in our day-to-day lives.
Totally.
We tend to operate with a very human-centric viewpoint, don't we? It doesn't quite align with the bigger picture. Why do you think that is? What makes it so hard to keep that cosmic scale in mind?
That's a great question. Maybe it's just the constant messaging we get. In our culture, it emphasizes self-importance, right? Self-esteem above all else.
It's all about you being the center of your world, which, well, it kind of clashes with this idea of a vast, holy God way out there.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that focus on the individual, it can certainly make it challenging to grasp a sense of scale where humanity isn't the main point of reference.
Right.
It actually reminds me of a story from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Remember that alien invasion fleet, this massive armada all ready to conquer Earth?
Oh, yeah, I remember that bit. And what happens? It's ridiculous.
They just, poof, get swallowed by this ridiculously small dog, this incredibly powerful force, supposed to be overwhelming, just rendered completely insignificant by something totally unexpected.
Yeah, that's such a vivid image, isn't it? A miscalibrated sense of scale. You have this expectation of overwhelming power, and it's just gone.
Yeah.
Because the perspective was totally wrong.
Precisely. And that's kind of the core of the spiritual issue we're talking about here. Our innate sense of scale is often way, way off.
I mean, think about it historically. For centuries, we literally thought the Earth was the center of the entire universe. That was our scale.
Right. Everything revolved around us. Took some major scientific shifts, didn't it, to dislodge that view and reveal the true, just mind-boggling vastness of the cosmos.
And that's really where understanding spiritual scale has to begin.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that God is infinitely greater than we can possibly fathom.
Yeah. Not just a little bigger, but existing on an entirely different plane almost.
Totally. He exists outside of this immense universe, which itself is still expanding and, honestly, mostly unknown to us.
Right. So to even begin to grasp this scale, we have to try and, well, move beyond our limited human perspective.
And a really crucial element of God's bigness is his holiness. Now, holiness, for someone who might not be familiar with that term in a, theological sense, what does it really mean?
Holiness, yeah. At its heart, it means being set apart. Distinct.
Yeah.
It speaks to God's otherness, his transcendence.
Okay, set apart.
But it also refers to his absolute purity, his complete lack of any sin or imperfection. It's just who he is, fundamentally, at his core.
Okay, absolute purity. Now here's where it gets really interesting and maybe challenging for some. Many people, even folks who aren't particularly religious, might agree that if God exists, he's probably good.
Sure.
Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, they'd rate him a solid 10. What's the flaw in thinking that way?
Well, the problem is that our human understanding of good is just so limited, isn't it? It's relative.
How so?
We base it on our own experiences, our own flawed comparisons. God's perfection isn't just like a slightly upgraded version of our goodness. It's qualitatively different, infinitely beyond our comprehension, really.
It's like trying to represent the Pacific Ocean with a single eyedropper of water or something.
Exactly. Our little 1 to 10 scale of goodness just can't contain the reality of God's holiness.
Yeah, you'd need a line that just goes off the paper, off the table, out the door.
Right. Our highest concept of good probably doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of God's perfect, unblemished nature.
Okay. And the other side of the scale, then, is our understanding of ourselves. Because just as we tend to underestimate God's holiness, we also often vastly underestimate our own sinfulness, right? Our own inherent lack of that divine holiness. Why do you think we have such a hard time seeing that in ourselves?
Oh, that's a tough one. Maybe it's a bit of a self-preservation thing. It's just easier to focus on our good intentions, maybe?
Or compare ourselves favorably to others.
Yeah, or compare ourselves to someone we perceive as worse off.
Hmm.
It's uncomfortable, isn't it, to really confront our own shortcomings, our own distance from that standard.
That makes a lot of sense. And this miscalibration, this getting the scale wrong, it has pretty significant consequences.
For sure.
For someone who doesn't believe, for instance. If they don't have a proper sense of this scale, they might look at their own life and think, you know what, I'm generally a good person.
I haven't murdered anyone.
I haven't robbed a bank.
Right.
They just don't recognize their deep spiritual need because their scale is off.
Yeah, they might be using a horizontal scale, looking left and right at other humans, and feeling relatively okay.
But the crucial scale is the vertical one.
Exactly. Are standing before a perfectly holy God. They miss that vast gulf.
And it's not just people who don't believe. Even as Christians, we can fall into this same trap, this distorted view.
Oh, definitely.
We might think, well, okay, I'm a believer now. I go to church. I try my best. Surely I'm doing pretty well spiritually, right?
Yeah, I'm not perfect, but I'm better than I used to be.
Exactly. And when we minimize our own sinfulness and we simultaneously underestimate God's holiness, what happens to our appreciation for the central act of the gospel, what Christ actually did for us?
It just shrinks, doesn't it? It diminishes it significantly.
Yeah. If the gap between our perceived goodness and God's perfection seems kind of small or manageable,
then Christ's sacrifice on the cross might just seem like, I don't know, a helpful gesture, rather than the absolutely radical, universe-altering act of love and redemption that it truly is.
right, our gratitude becomes lukewarm at best.
It shifts from like a desperate need for rescue, for grace, to maybe just needing a little divine assistance to cross a small ditch.
But the reality, as we're exploring with this idea of scale, is that the gap is immeasurably vast. It's a canyon.
And, a growing understanding of this scale, it isn't usually a one-time lightning bolt realization, is it? It's more of an ongoing process.
Yeah, that's right. It's part of Christian growth, what theologians often call sanctification.
Becoming more aware gradually of God's holiness and kind of inevitably our own shortcomings over time.
It's a lifelong journey, really, of our eyes being opened more and more to the true nature of God and our true nature in light of that.
And the Bible, thankfully, uses some incredibly powerful images to help us grasp this scale, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. One that's immediately striking is Jesus' teaching on the speck and the plank, Matthew chapter 7.
Right. The speck and the plank. What's the scenario he paints there?
He asks, basically, why do you look at the tiny speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the massive plank in your own eye?
Yeah. It's this image of someone obsessing over a tiny, tiny flaw in someone else,
while completely ignoring this huge piece of construction timber sticking out of their own face.
Describe that image for a moment, the sheer absurdity of it.
It's almost comical, isn't it? Someone walking around the whole log, a 2x4 protruding from their eye socket, yet they're hyper-focused on a tiny speck of dust in someone else's vision.
Huh. Yeah, the humor actually underlines the point, doesn't it?
It really does. It highlights the massive discrepancy between what we often notice in others and what we completely fail to acknowledge in ourselves.
Our sense of proportion, our sense of scale when it comes to our own faults versus others is just wildly distorted.
It's like we're trying to perform delicate eye surgery on someone else, while we've got this massive obstruction blocking our own view. It's impossible.
Yeah. And another really powerful illustration of this miscalibrated scale is that parable, the one about the unmerciful servant, Matthew 18.
Oh, that's a heavy hitter. Yeah. What's the core of that story?
Well, it's about this servant who owed the king an absolutely astronomical debt, like 10,000 talents.
Which was, an amount that was practically impossible to ever repay. Unfathomable wealth back then.
Totally unimaginable.
Yeah.
And the king, just out of incredible mercy, forgives the entire debt, wipes it clean.
A debt that would have been financially ruinous, not just for the servant, but maybe even impacting the whole kingdom's economy. Gone.
But then what does that same servant do immediately after?
He turns right around and finds someone who owed him a minuscule amount in comparison. Just 100 denarii, like a few months' wages, maybe?
Pocket change, basically, compared to the fortune he was just forgiven.
Exactly. And he grabs the guy, starts choking him, demands immediate repayment. Harshly.
The contrast is just staggering, isn't it? It throws the scale of forgiveness into such sharp relief.
It really does. The first servant received this unimaginable, life-altering mercy, but he couldn't extend even a tiny fraction of that same mercy to someone else. What does that tell us about his understanding, his grasp of what he'd actually been given?
It shows he fundamentally didn't get it right. He didn't grasp the magnitude, the scale of the king's forgiveness. His own debt was so immense that the smaller debt should have seemed completely insignificant by comparison. But he couldn't see that. His scale was broken.
Exactly. Jesus uses this extreme example, this huge difference in amounts, to highlight that if we truly understood the immense scale of forgiveness God has shown us,
Then our response to the relatively minor offenses people commit against us would be radically different.
yeah, our internal sense of scale regarding our own debt to God and the debts others might owe us is so often completely out of whack.
And then there's Isaiah's vision, Isaiah chapter 6. Now that's a scene that really drives home the sheer holiness of God, the scale of his being.
Oh, it's a pivotal moment. Absolutely transformative for Isaiah. He sees the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted.
And the train of his robe filled the temple. Just imagine that visual.
And these powerful angelic beings, the seraphim, are there covering their faces, covering their feet, and just constantly proclaiming, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory."
What's the impact of that scene? The description says the doorposts and thresholds shook, the temple filled with smoke.
It's overwhelming. It's a display of God's power, his majesty, his glory that's almost too much to comprehend. It's an encounter with the absolute, unadulterated holiness of God.
But it's Isaiah's reaction that's so incredibly telling for our understanding of scale. What does he say? What's his immediate response?
He just cries out, "Woe to me, I am ruined."
Ruined. Not just, oops, I messed up.
No. "For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty."
Notice his immediate profound awareness of his own impurity, his uncleanness in the presence of such perfect holiness.
Yeah. He doesn't try to justify himself. He doesn't compare himself to others in the room thinking, "Well, I'm not as bad as that guy."
No, he's utterly undone by the contrast. In that single moment, he understands the true scale.
It's not just a mild sense of imperfection he feels. It's a feeling of utter ruin, of being completely inadequate, fundamentally unclean in the face of divine purity.
And this was Isaiah, a prophet of God, someone already dedicated, already serving him.
Precisely. Even someone striving to follow God, when confronted with the reality of his holiness, is just floored by the immensity of the gap. And what happens right after this realization?
There's a cleansing, isn't there? A seraph takes a live coal from the altar.
With tongs. Because even the angel couldn't touch it directly.
Right, and touches Isaiah's lips with it, saying, his guilt is taken away, his sin is atoned for.
It's an act of God's grace. It comes in response to Isaiah's recognition of his own unworthiness and the impossible gap.
Which just underscores that even our cleansing, our ability to be made right before God, it comes from God's initiative. It's not something we achieve by trying harder to bridge that gap ourselves.
And then what's Isaiah's response after he's been cleansed by grace?
God asks, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah immediately volunteers, here am I, send me.
See? That encounter with the true scale of God's holiness and his own sinfulness, followed by grace, leads directly to this heart of humble obedience, this eagerness, this willingness to serve.
It's like seeing God in his true glory just recalibrates everything, doesn't it? The petty concerns, the self-illusions, they just fall away in the light of this overwhelming reality.
And it's not just Isaiah. You see this pattern throughout history. Many significant figures of faith have had similar encounters, moments that drastically shifted their perspective on this scale.
It's kind of like the analogy of the sun, maybe?
How so?
Well, the sun is essential for all life on Earth, right?
Right.
But if you try to get too close, Its raw power, its heat, its radiation, it becomes overwhelming, even destructive.
Yeah. That's interesting. God's holiness, while the ultimate source of all that, is good and true and beautiful.
Can feel overwhelming, maybe even terrifying, when we truly grasp its magnitude in relation to our own flawed being.
And this concept of scale is absolutely crucial then for understanding the immensity of God's love, too.
How does that connect?
Well, why would God go to such extraordinary lengths, sending his son, the cross, to redeem us? It's because the gap created by our sin, our lack of holiness, isn't just a small step. It's not a puddle we can hop over.
It's an unbridgeable chasm.
Exactly. It's like trying to jump across the Grand Canyon at its widest point.
Yeah. No matter how good a jumper you think you are, how much training you do, it's simply impossible. The distance is just too vast.
And that's what human religion, apart from grace, often tries to do, isn't it? It's like trying to build these flimsy little rope bridges across the Grand Canyon of our sin through our own efforts, our own rule-keeping.
But the gospel recognizes the utter impossibility of that task from the start. The scale is just wrong.
Or think of it like trying to swim from Los Angeles to Hawaii.
Okay, big swim.
We could all jump in the ocean at Santa Monica Pier and start swimming, right? Some might be stronger swimmers than others, make it a bit further out.
But nobody's actually going to reach Hawaii that way. The distance is simply insurmountable on our own power.
Exactly. We might make some, relative progress compared to the person next to us, but we'd be nowhere near the actual destination. That's the scale of the gap between our own best righteousness and God's perfect holiness.
Wow. Okay, so this brings us to a verse like, say, 1 Peter 1:106, be holy because I am holy. How do we understand that command in light of this vast, seemingly impossible scale?
Yeah, that's a verse that sometimes gets pulled out to suggest that achieving God's level of holiness is something we can and should just, do through our own willpower and effort.
Just try harder to be holy.
But when we really consider the scale we've been talking about, God's absolute purity, Isaiah's reaction, how do we reconcile that command? I think the key is to constantly ask, what is the definition of holy that God is using there? What's the standard?
It's not about being relatively good by human measures, comparing ourselves to others.
No, it's about the absolute perfection, the standard we saw with Isaiah, the standard that is God himself.
Right. So when God says, be holy, the benchmark isn't our neighbor or even the best, most saintly person we know. It's his own perfect, unattainable by us holiness.
Exactly. And that's where maybe the analogy of jumping to the moon fits in.
You know what?
Someone might boast, hey, I've been practicing. I can jump 6 inches higher than I could last year.
Okay, progress.
But that's utterly irrelevant, almost laughable if their stated goal is to jump to the moon. The scale of the goal makes the small improvement meaningless in terms of achieving the objective.
Right. And that highlights the futility, really, of striving for God's kind of holiness independently through our own steam.
Yeah. And you see this realization dawning on even the spiritual giants throughout history. Think of Martin Luther. Before he grasped grace, tormenting himself, trying desperately to achieve a righteousness acceptable to God through his own efforts, his own religious observance.
And it drove him to despair, didn't it? Because he could never satisfy that standard. He understood the scale.
Or the Apostle Paul, who listed all his credentials, his zealous law-keeping, and then called it all garbage compared to knowing Christ. He realized his own efforts fell impossibly short. And the writer of Hebrews touches on this again in chapter 12, verse 4, saying something like, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood.
What's the point there?
Well, it seems to suggest that maybe those who think achieving God's standard of holiness is a relatively straightforward task, something manageable with enough effort. They haven't truly grappled with the depth and the power of sin. They haven't really fought it to the bitter end and realized its grip and the impossibility of overcoming it alone.
It's like they haven't even begun to exert the kind of ultimate life or death struggle that would be necessary if it were even possible to achieve holiness on our own. They haven't understood the scale of the battle.
Exactly. And then Hebrews 12 continues with this incredible contrast between two mountains, Mount Sinai and Mount Zion.
Okay, yeah. This is powerful imagery.
What's the significance of that contrast, especially in the context of scale?
Well, Mount Sinai, described starting in verse 18, is depicted as this terrifying, untouchable place. There's burning fire, darkness, gloom, a storm, a trumpet blast, a voice so powerful the Israelites begged not to hear it anymore.
Yeah, even touching the mountain meant death.
Right. It represents the old covenant law, God's holy standard revealed, but in a way that felt inaccessible, terrifying, and ultimately brought condemnation because no one could meet it. The scale was overwhelming in a negative way.
The imagery is absolutely designed to convey the sheer terror and the impossibility of measuring up to God's holiness through our own efforts under that system.
But then, starting in verse 22, the writer says, "But you have come to Mount Zion." And the description flips completely.
What's Zion like?
It's the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, a place filled with joy, thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly.
Wow.
The church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You've come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of righteous people made perfect.
Made perfect. Not by themselves.
Exactly. And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel.
The scale there is just immense, from a mountain of terrifying, untouchable law that brings death,
To this vibrant heavenly realm of perfect holiness, populated by angels and perfected saints, where we actually have access to God himself through Christ. It's an infinitely higher yet accessible standard of holiness.
And right after describing this incredible contrast, verse 25 gives this crucial warning, or exhortation. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks.
Him being Jesus, the mediator of this new covenant.
Yeah. What's the implication of that warning, especially in light of this massive shift in scale from Sinai to Zion?
Well, given the immense scale of God's accessible holiness, now revealed through Jesus, given that we've come to this reality, refusing to listen to him, refusing to embrace the new covenant of grace offered, it's just the height of folly. It's rejecting the only way to exist in that holy realm.
Because the righteousness that's required to stand in that holy presence, in that heavenly Jerusalem, among those perfected saints, it isn't something we achieve or earn.
Yeah.
It's a gift. It's received purely through faith in Jesus Christ and his finished work on the cross. To think we can somehow achieve it ourselves or add to it, it just completely misunderstands the scale and belittles the incredible magnitude of that gift.
And Hebrews 12 wraps up that whole section, verses 28 and 29. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe.
Reverence and awe, because we understand the scale.
Exactly, for our God is a consuming fire. It all circles back to gratitude, doesn't it? True worship flows from understanding the scale.
Absolutely. Receiving this unshakable kingdom, this perfect righteousness as a sheer gift, it should inspire profound thankfulness and a worship characterized by deep reverence and awe, because we recognize the true scale of God's consuming holiness and our utter dependence on his grace.
So, okay, to try and bring it all together for today.
Yeah.
The first S of the gospel, scale, is fundamentally about grasping this immense, almost incomprehensible difference between God's perfect holiness and our own deep-seated sinfulness.
Yeah, it's a gap so vast, like the Grand Canyon, like swimming to Hawaii, like jumping to the moon, that we could never, ever bridge it on our own. No amount of effort suffices.
In understanding this scale, really letting it sink in, is foundational, isn't it?
It has to be. It shapes everything else. It shapes how we see our need for God in the first place, the absolute enormity of Christ's sacrifice, and the depth of our gratitude for the gift of grace.
And it has real, practical implications for how we view ourselves, how we view others, how we approach God every single day.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, next time, we'll delve into the subsequent S, which, as you can probably guess, builds directly upon this crucial understanding of scale.
Looking forward to it. And for now, maybe we can encourage you, our listener, to just take some time to reflect on your own sense of spiritual scale.
Yeah.
How do you truly perceive the holiness of God? And how do you truly perceive your own standing before him? Just consider how that understanding, or maybe misunderstanding, shapes your appreciation for the grace you've been given.
It's a really fundamental question, isn't it? One that can truly transform your perspective on the entire gospel message. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Until our next exploration.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.